Hi, Kate Fry here. Okay, this video is more extemporaneous. Previous videos, I've spent a long time doing research and preparing. Here is more off the top of my head. But I have some thoughts on AOC, social democratic activist Eric Blanc, and political theory. And we'll see how it goes. First, AOC, I'm sure everyone watching this knows who she is, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's a first-term congressperson from the 14th District of New York, which consists of parts of the Bronx and Queens. It's half Hispanic, largely low income. She defeated in 2018 10-term incumbent Joe Crowley, who was a machine politician, basically kept winning year after year after year, because no one votes in the primaries. No one, and few people turn out for the midterms anyway. People rightfully know it has a little connection with their lives, and there's a little enthusiasm. And so anyway, it was AOC had defeated him. It was an upset, and she became a media star overnight. She was a bartender before she ran. She was in the DSA, Democratic Socialist of America, kind of a large but very amorphous organization which kind of emerged in the wake of the Sanders campaign, or maybe a little bit earlier. Previously, the DSA was kind of known as a sort of a college town mailing list. If you lived in a college town and were more or less liberal or went to a couple demonstrations, you'd end up on their mailing list. It was an academic mailing list. But in the wake of the Sanders campaigns, both campaigns had an explosive growth. Anyway, it represented an amorphous democratic socialist movement, which was never defined. There's no definition to it. Okay, so anyway, AOC right away became a celebrity. Magazines featured her. She campaigned around the country for, quote, progressive Democratic politicians. She brought a lot of young people into the Democratic Party when I think they should have been leaving in droves. She created illusions that the left can take over the Democratic Party, which I think is total nonsense and a very dangerous idea. So, some things about AOC, which is coming out now. She early on, she had an interview with a radio station. I forget who it was, and someone asked her how she defines socialism, and her answer was like amorphous, like, I think socialism is when everyone is treated fairly and has an equal chance, and blah blah blah. No, that's nonsense. Socialism is when working people control the means of production, control the economy, like workers' democracy. That's socialism. That's the historically agreed on meaning for like over 100 years. And another time, shortly after, another interview, she kind of dissed theory. She said something like, well, like political theory, said, my mother was a poor immigrant. She never would have understood theory, and these academic people have this whole theory. Like, she was making it seem like political theory was elitist, and that was just a way of opportunism. Yeah, you have your theory. You can criticize me for not being a real socialist, but you're well wrapped up in this elitist theory. I mean, she was using an anti-elitist posture as a way of justifying her opportunism. Anyway, it got worse from there. There's just signals right at the beginning. It got worse from there. So she voted for every military budget that passed. She voted for the $730 billion, Trump's $730 billion military budget. She voted for the recent bill, the bailout bill, which contains, I have the list here. Hold on, I actually have the list here. It contains $17 billion for defense contractors, $25 billion for the airline industry, $500 billion for other corporate bailouts, and so on, and large amounts of money for the coup in Venezuela, on and on and on, for really supporting the coup in Venezuela. She voted for it. She most likely voted for the CARES Act, which is a $4 trillion corporate bailout. She criticized it. Jimmy Dore makes a case that she did vote for it. It was an unrecorded voice vote, and she doesn't quite say how she voted. She most likely did. She voted for Nancy Pelosi to be Speaker of the House, which is against what she originally said she was going to do. She voted for Pelosi. She calls Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi, Mama Bear. She had a picture of herself on Rolling Stone magazine, the squad, and then Pelosi in the middle, which is not a good sign. I mean, this is the exact opposite of the position she was taking when she first got in. And whole bunch of really, really bad signals. So Green New Deal, I mean, it sounds good on the surface. The idea came from the Green Party, and yeah, we desperately need to do something about climate change. But her version of it is very market-based. It's capitalist. It's very market-based, market incentives. It's getting the private sector involved. It's unworkable. Like people compared this to the California high-speed rail project under a Democratic politician. So under Newsom, like a year or so ago, 2 years ago, it failed simply because the market couldn't entice these corporations to stay in it. That's why we don't have a high-speed rail system in California or anyplace else. So just PR. She had a well-publicized protest, very photogenic protest in front of Pelosi's office with, I think that was the Sunrise Movement or Young Environmentalist Group. She joined them. Turns out, it came out very recently that it was staged. Pelosi knew about it. She knew about it right away. It was a photo op session. Extinction Rebellion was the group I was trying to think of. It was Pelosi knew about it. It was staged. It wasn't really quite what it seemed. The coup attempts in Venezuela, Juan Guaido under the Trump administration. AOC initially was sent out a tweet, well, we have to be very careful about U.S. intervention. And she later on, someone asked her and she said, well, I defer to party leadership. Well, party leadership supports the coup in Venezuela. Bolivia, the coup in Bolivia, first she retweeted a tweet by Bernie Sanders, which is very critical of it, okay? But again, it's like sending a strongly worded letter. Like, what is that going to do? But she did retweet something very critical of it. Then she had herself photoed with a group of coup supporters behind a coup flag. And, AOC supporters say she was manipulated or allowed herself to be manipulated. I don't know. Neither case did she really try to build. She's Latino herself. Neither case did she attempt to build a movement, right? It was political posturing. She wasn't outspoken at all against either event. She was trying to build a movement. Yeah, she was not trying to build a movement. Okay, so yeah, the recent she most likely voted for, as I said, most likely voted for the CARES Act. Okay, the recent controversy, as I talked about, alluded to in a previous video with Jimmy Dore, the political comedian Jimmy Dore, suggested that, by the way, Jimmy Dore was originally a big supporter of hers. She was on the Jimmy Dore show. I think first media exposure she got after she was elected, and they sort of had a falling out. Dore was moving much further to the left. Well, recently, and she didn't answer his calls really. Well, anyway, more recently, a couple weeks ago, Dore suggested that why don't she threaten to not vote for Pelosi to be Speaker of the House again, as a way, like, unless she supports Medicare for all. And that set off this political firestorm, especially on social media, on Twitter, and on leftish wide range of leftish YouTubers and among the left wing of the Democratic Party. And I think it exposed their hypocrisy. Dore was absolutely right. AOC didn't want to do that. She didn't want to go up against Pelosi. And, the right wing of the Democratic Party does this all the time. Another woman, like a, quote, corporate Democrat, actually did the same thing. She threatened not to vote for Pelosi, and Pelosi appointed her to this very important committee. And so the right is never, either the Republican Party or the right in the Democratic Party is never hesitant at all to fight for their stuff. But the quote left, quotation marks here, always wimps out because they ultimately are serving their front for corporate interests. So it's Jimmy Dore totally knew that AOC wasn't going to do this. I mean, calling for Medicare for all or some kind of national health care plan in the middle of like the worst pandemic in U.S. history. And I mean, something you desperately need to do. But, well, supporters of AOC say, well, we have to work on other things, on the bailout, on this, on that, on the stimulus. No, they're not mutually exclusive. That's total nonsense. And there's all kinds of the media tried to make it against Jimmy Dore himself, attacking him. He's a shock jock and Assad apologist and trying to dig up everything they can to attack him. It's not Dore himself. It's not, he brought it up, and I think he did a very good point. I don't agree with everything Jimmy Dore says, but I think he's making a valuable contribution. He's exposing the hypocrisy. Of course, AOC's not going to do this. She's a career politician. I didn't mention she's in the DSA. We don't know her connection with it. Her current, they enthusiastically support her. Essentially, people say it's like they're providing free campaign staff for her. Nobody knows her involvement if she's still a member. All you have to do in the DSA is pay $60 a year or $5 a month, and you're a member. They have no accountability over their elected officials. They call it electeds. They have no accountability over their elected officials, so we don't really know. Okay, so now I'm going to, AOC, as I mentioned, discounted theory. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, there's a social, like, quote, democratic socialist activist, kind of famous. Probably he's the main voice of it right now, Eric Blanc. And Eric is a young guy. I briefly met him. He came up here. He had a book on the teacher strike last year, and he was going around. I went to a DSA meeting, public meeting. I'm not in the DSA, but I went to a public meeting near where I live, and he seems like a very nice guy, genuinely nice, very friendly person. I utterly, totally disagree with his politics. His politics are horrible. So anyway, his history, he was a Trotskyist. He was in a group called Socialist Organizer in the Bay Area. They're, very long story, a Lambertist group. The Trotskyist movement has zillions of splits, extremely complicated history. I am a Trotskyist myself. I think there are way too many tendencies and factions and sectarianism, the idea of apostolic succession. You're either a Grantite, a Taffyite, a Mandelite. I think it's these thinkers, many, not all, but many of these thinkers did have something to offer. I'm not dismissing them, but they had these tiny little tendencies. But anyway, he was in a group called a Lambertist group in the Bay Area called Socialist Organizers. Father was a leader of it, and I don't fully know too much about it beyond that. I read some of their literature. I liked it from what I understand. Anyway, he left that. I don't know the whole story. He was actually a teacher, I believe, California teacher, history teacher, I think. And he was active in the teachers union, and that brought him into politics. Anyway, from Socialist Organizer, either joined or was very close to the ISO. The ISO is the International Socialist Organization. They collapsed, I believe it was about 2 years ago now. Long story, I was very briefly in it for a couple of months, probably like 15 years ago now. They collapsed in a rape scandal. They were kind of imploding for a while before that. Anyway, there was this very large faction. The ISO itself, coming from a Trotskyist background, they did not officially support the Democratic Party. We don't, both parties, we need to build political independence. And okay, the basic idea, but they were waffling at this idea quite a bit. And especially 2016, even more so. And a lot in 2016, large factions wanted to support Sanders, or they had a large movement within the group that wanted a dirty break, quote, dirty break from the Democrats, or some kind of gradual break, and very large. In fact, much of that faction actually now is in the DSA, essentially is in the Democratic Party itself. Anyway, Eric Blanc was either in the ISO or was very close to it. We don't really know. I think he was in it. But he was very close to the pro-Democratic Party faction of the ISO. And he left before, as far as I know, he left before the ISO collapsed. He left before the final collapse. And he joined the DSA. He went off on his own, different trajectory. Now he's close to Jacobin and the DSA crowd, and very big Sanders supporter. And he essentially believes that his book, one of the main themes of his book on the teacher strike, is that it was inspired by Bernie Sanders. This new wave of activism and rebellion was inspired by the Sanders campaign, which I think is total nonsense. Some of the teachers, like I've talked with some of the teachers who were or first organized the original West Virginia strike. They couldn't care less about Sanders. They were in the IWW, several anarchist groups. I don't think they had nothing to do with Sanders. I think some of these other teacher strikes were set off by that. Sanders didn't play any role. And Sanders did not, or he called him the organizer in chief. He did not organize anything. He did go to picket lines at times, yes, but he didn't like call for strikes or really lead a strike wave. He was, everything he did was strictly within the confines of the Democratic Party. I mean, Democratic Party politicians always stand on picket lines, but that's not what he did. Was nothing out of the norm. So anyway, Eric Blanc was like a Harringtonite, saw like a social democratic movement within the Democratic Party itself. And he's vague, eventually we have to break, we have to leave, and we have to leave the party, but for now. And he's bringing people back in, the DSA layer, bringing people back in. He's a major voice for this. He posted something on Facebook, which said something like very congratulatory on Biden being elected. So the left should own this. The left should be very proud of this. I was like, what? Biden is possibly to the right of Trump. Biden is the guy who designed the system, almost personally, designed the system of mass incarceration. There are $5 billion set aside for local police to ramp up the repression. He was behind very strict drug laws. He literally used to brag about writing the Patriot Act, which ICE is, it calls for ICE and the mass repression, which Trump is using. He's using the system Biden created. Like the left has nothing to be proud of in electing Biden. And I think in the coming period, they're going to force, or Biden's been very rapidly breaking into his campaign promises, and which is a good thing. The illusions are wearing off so much sooner. It's a good thing. But the left, to be effective, has to clearly differentiate itself from the Democratic Party, and it's hard to do that if you're been literally campaigning for Biden. And Eric Blanc was campaigning for Biden. I think he's playing a very bad role. Although, that layer is not really that rooted in the working class. They're petty bourgeois students for the most part, but they do sow a lot of illusions, and they're building back up the Democratic Party despite their vague ideas of eventually leaving it. Okay, which brings us to theory. As I mentioned, AOC kind of diss theory. And okay, Louis Prioct is a guy who has a blog called Unrepentant Marxist, which has a big following among parts of the left. I have very strong disagreements with Louis Prioct, but he does, to his credit, he has a lot of interesting things on his blog. He agrees with me. He did not support Sanders. He really hates working with the Democratic Party. And in this, I agree with him, and he has written some really good stuff. He's written some really bad stuff too, but he has said some good stuff. And he had some things on the political background or the theoretical background of Eric Blanc and others in that milieu. And it's interesting. And I'm just going to give a brief summation. Okay, so there is this guy, a scholar named Lars. He's basically a Norwegian dance instructor or a professor of choreography. And he teaches, I think he's an assistant professor at McGill in Montreal, Canada. And he's a socialist. I don't know what tendencies, I don't know, he hasn't really said, but he's taken like an amateur, he speaks and reads Russian very fluently. He's taken like on his own a sideline interest in Russian socialist history, early socialist history. And he's one of the few people who's had access to the archives, the old Soviet archives, which are still kind of closely guarded. And he's written some interesting stuff about Lenin. Lenin, of course, led the Russian Revolution, and really complicated theory. I can't get into this too much. I could make a couple of videos about it, but Lenin wrote this classic essay, "What is to be done?" And essentially, it's usually regarded as the foundation of Leninism. He called for a professional, a vanguard party made up of professional revolutionaries who would bring class consciousness to the workers. At the time, the Russian socialist movement, which was kind of the same thing as a union movement, evolving in Russia, early 20th century, was very amorphous. And there was a lot of debates and struggles to provide leadership for it or which direction it would go in. So Lenin's essay is widely regarded by most people like the foundation of Leninism, creating a revolutionary vanguard party. That's the traditional idea. Lars says, well, it might not quite be true. What he says is that he disputes the like centrality of what is to be done of that essay. He says it wasn't really, when it came out, it wasn't really that as meaningful as later generations think it is. Like the real thing about Leninism was like after the Second World War established, and basically says that, like when Lars calls for professional revolutionaries, what he really means are people who are very well dedicated. And his take, or what came out of that, is like after the Second World War, especially, there was some distortion, like historiography of what is to be done, partly from the Cold War. The right wing or the Cold War historians may seem like Lenin was an authoritarian monster, while mostly Trotskyist historians had various different takes on it, which were different. And there's been a lot of debate over what is to be done, exactly what was going on. Lars says it wasn't really that important. It was a throwaway. It was a polemical debate, essay, and debates going on, but it wasn't really that important. He says there wasn't really a break. Usually it's considered a break. There wasn't really that much of a break between Lenin and Second International Orthodoxy. Okay, so another long history. There was the socialist movement. There were like 4 internationals. There was the first international, which kind of collapsed, mixture of some early Marxists and anarchists, basically collapsed. There was the second international, formed after Marx died. Engels was still alive, I believe, at the time. Anyway, it was huge. The center was the German SPD socialist movement. They had huge fights with reformists and huge battles. It finally collapsed in World War I when the leadership the German Socialist Party voted for the war credits. Okay, so one of the leading theoreticians was Kautsky, a guy named Karl Kautsky, and he was like the semi-official successor to Karl Marx. He was like the Pope of Marxism. Some people think he was more of a popularizer. I don't know, but he defended like Marxist orthodoxy. And I've read some of his stuff. I read his book on early Christianity and the Hutterite movement, which is really interesting stuff. I read The Road to Our Power, which I haven't read, is more famous. He kind of definitely fell apart. Politically, Kautsky did fall apart towards the end. He fights with like Rosa Luxemburg. They originally were allies. At a certain point, Kautsky Rosa Luxemburg was fighting with the reformist, and Kautsky was kind of a centrist. Okay, well, Lenin originally really liked Kautsky. He said, he's our teacher. And the mainstream idea, the conventional wisdom, is that they had a break. I mean, Lenin later fiercely criticized Kautsky. There's the famous essay, The Proletariat Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, which shows the difference between like Kautsky by that time was what we call a social democrat. And he points out the difference between a social democrat and a revolutionary communist or a revolutionary socialist. Okay, well, according to Lars, all that stuff came later. That Lenin really was expressing, what do you think of Kautsky? He was expressing like Second International Orthodoxy in Russian circumstances. And I think he kind of makes a case of it. I'm not a Lenin scholar. I admit that. I read like his 8 or 9 sort of classical works, but I'm not a Lenin scholar. Okay, so basically anyway, having said all that, largely was kind of sponsored or promoted by this group called the CPGB POC, Communist Party of Great Britain, and I guess Provisional Organizing Committee. There are actually several organizations called the CPGB, and really complicated history. The original Stalinist Communist Party of Great Britain collapsed in the 70s or 80s due to Euro communism. They kind of dissolved themselves, but several splinter groups wanted to still be in a communist group, so there's several. There's one group, CPGB ML. They carry these huge portraits of Stalin and they're praised. They're kind of silly. The CPGB, I believe it's POC, has more a group of intellectuals around London. They've had some interesting stuff. They see themselves bringing intellectual leadership to the British socialist movement, and they've sponsored talks, and they have some interesting thinkers around them. I don't know an awful lot about them. Anyway, they sponsored Lars Lee. One of these, Mike McNair, wrote essays about it and a book about it, and they came to be known as like neo-Kautskyists, neo-Kauts. And there was kind of a tendency. There was so basically saying like Kautsky before he collapsed, before he fell apart. he was expressing, revolutionary socialism at its best, which Lenin used in the conditions of Russia at the time. And I think it kind of makes some sense. Saying that most socialist groups today are running off a very distorted, caricatured version of Leninism, really tighten it. And yeah, socialist organizations do. I mentioned the ISO imploded. The PSL is currently going through some difficulties. I'm not a member, and I won't comment on it, but there's some stuff percolating. They've had some really horrible internal stuff. And if you're in the PSL, you disagree, I'd be happy to interview you. But there's that group. There are so many socialist organizations which got to be a mess. And partly there's this British SWP, the same thing. I think it may be partly because of it running on this caricatured version of Leninism. Anyway, so this debate was picked up by people like Eric Blanc, the DSA Jacobin crowd, who are social democrats. They're not at all revolutionary socialists. And they jumped on this debate, like Kautsky, the Kautsky debate, and Jacobin had a couple of articles on it. And I think they used it for their own purposes to support basically liberalism, essentially saying that, long theoretical debates, but essentially saying that Lenin would have voted for Biden, and people have said this, because of, using Kautsky or Lars Lee's interpretation of what was going on, and most people who call themselves Leninists really dislike Lars Lee. They really strongly dislike him and totally disagree. I think it's Lars Lee does make a point, but I'm not a Lenin scholar, not yet. Anyway, I have some of this work in my bookcase behind me here. Anyway, so these debates were going on. Eric Blanc and the DSA came to some parts of this group jumped on this interpretation of Kautsky, and they used it themselves to justify basically supporting the Democratic Party, like Lenin would have voted for Biden, which is totally ridiculous. It's not totally absurd. And I'm condensing and sort of caricaturing the argument somewhat, but that's basically what they would say. So Eric Blanc has uses to justify, come to some really bad conclusions, like the whole AOC Jimmy Dore debate. He took the AOC side. Well, the main thing right now is to fight against austerity, fight for the stimulus. We can worry about Medicare for all later. Like we're in the middle. Dude, we're in the middle of the worst pandemic in U.S. history. And the idea is to expose and destroy the Democratic Party, remove their hegemony over working people. So anyway, it just proves that theory is important, and kind of a short video, more off the top of my head. I've been meaning to make this for a little while. My two dogs, Max and Molly, are sitting beside me. And I got another hour before they start demanding their second walk for the day. Okay, I will see you. Goodbye.